Chapter 1. PAWEL. Mead and Rumours. The rain had just settled as a thin sheen upon Lublin's cobbled streets when PAWEL rode through the city gate. The guards recognized him instantly and let him pass without a word. The Hussar order's cloak required no explanation here. It was the same wherever he went. His blue mantle, marked with the order's sigil, opened nearly every gate in the duchies. People gave him space on the road. A Hussar in a blue cloak could be salvation or judgment. Those who bowed as he passed did not always do so out of respect, but just as often out of fear. PAWEL ran a hand over the stubble on his chin and felt the weariness cling to his body like rust to a blade. Another journey, another investigation. And once again it had ended, as it always did. Fear, superstition, and shadows that lived only in people's minds. No demon, no witch, not even a curse. Only men, just as cowardly as they were cruel. Lublin stretched out before him. The city wall rose like a scar of stone around the streets below, its towers proclaiming authority rather than safety. He rode past the cramped workshops where the smiths kept their forges burning day and night. Hammer strikes fell like heartbeats across the city. The stench of iron and coal mingled with the reek of slaughter and refuse. It was a wealthy city, yes, but not a beautiful one. In the markets, silk and spices were sold side by side with bloody animal carcasses. Church bells rang for piety, yet ducats changed hands faster than prayers. No dreams were built here. Here, power was bought and sold. PAWEL shook his head and tightened his grip on the reins. Lublin might be his home, but its heart beat to the rhythm of the forge's hammers, cold, hard, and unforgiving. The Hussar order had its heart here, in Vanborg. The fortress that rose above the river like a black tooth of stone. Its spires pierced the sky like spears, and beneath them Lublin sprawled between its two hills. To the west lay the harbour reeking of tar and salt water. To the east rose the dark shafts of the mines, and the smoke from the smelters hung like a shroud over the city. For most, this was a holy place, where knights and monks waged the Lord's war against darkness and swore by Orion, the prophet who had called mankind to battle in eternal devotion. But for PAWEL, it had never been so. He had seen too many people bleed in Orion's name, yet the darkness itself had never once appeared. He had joined the order in his early 20s, not out of piety, but out of hunger. A roof over his head, a full stomach, and at times the chance to bring justice. That had been enough for him. He remembered the days down at the harbour, how his father had toiled with ropes and cargo amidst the same stench of tar and rotting nets. That was a life he never wished to return to. In Vanborg he found discipline, a place in the ranks, and a sword in his hand. No one asked why he stood there, only that he did his duty. Faith had never driven him. If God existed, he was as indifferent as the haze of coal smoke over Lublin. Men, on the other hand, they lied, hated, killed. And it was their trail PAWEL had followed through more than 30 investigations in the 10 years he had served the order. Always the same ending. No witches, no demons, only mankind's own sins. A voice broke through his thoughts.
PAWEL, is that really you, old hound?
PAWEL pulled at the reins and saw a man step forward from between the market stalls. Captain Stannislaw Nowak wore the dark green coat of the city guard, but over his shoulders hung a cloak worn thin by years of service. His face was lined, his nose once broken and never properly healed, and his beard was greying at the temples. Yet he carried himself with an easy authority. the man who had once been a simple gate guard, but through stubbornness and cunning had risen all the way to command Lublin's watch. PAWEL smirked. "Stannislaw, I see they still haven't managed to make you look like a gentleman."
And I see they still haven't managed to make you look happy.
Stannislaw shot back with a laugh that was more coarse than merry. They clasped each other's forearms in greeting, like two men who had survived the same filth but taken different roads since. They had first met when PAWEL, a young recruit of the order, could barely handle a lance. Back then, Stannislaw had been a mere city guard, grim, but always quick with advice for the dock worker's son who wanted to become something more. The years had honed them both, PAWEL into a cynical hussar knight, Stannislaw into a captain who knew every alley of Lublin.
"Come,"
said Stannislaw, nodding toward a nearby tavern.
"You need mead. I've got a feeling it's going to be a long night."
PAWEL opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. He knew that if he rode straight to Vanborg, Grandmaster Dalibor would throw a new assignment at him before he'd even pulled off his boots. And the Grandmaster never showed mercy to a tired man. "A cup or two, then," PAWEL conceded, "but only because I don't want to see your grinning face out on the street." Stanislaw grinned wide and clapped him on the arm.
"Then we'll take 2 extra for good fortune, so you'll have strength enough to keep looking so damned sour, my noble knight."
Together they turned toward the tavern door, away from the fortress's shadow and into the din of voices, the smell of charred meat, and the heavy warmth of mead. The door to the tavern groaned like an old man turning in his sleep. Warm, greasy air rolled out to meet them, thick with the smell of burnt lard, wet wool, spilled mead, and the sour tang of yesterday's smoke still trapped beneath the rafters. When PAWEL stepped over the threshold, the world of Lublin's rain-fouled streets fell away behind him, replaced by a dense murmur of voices that drifted like a living mist above the people. He paused just inside the doorway. The interior was lit by tallow candles that trembled in iron sconces, their wavering light smearing long shadows across the timber walls. The beams above were blackened from decades of soot, sagging slightly under their own age, and from them hung strings of dried herbs, talismans, and a few unlucky haunches of meat turning grey in the heat. The floor was of packed earth, polished to mud by hundreds of boots. Tables sat unevenly in the room, like tired old horses, each one carved by knife tips and stained by men who'd never wiped a spill in their lives. People filled the hall in a way only a rain-heavy evening could force. Thick-armed butchers in blood-flecked aprons leaned over mugs the size of their fists. Fishermen in patched coats, still smelling of river rot and wet rope, argued loudly with a pair of merchants whose soft hands wrapped jealously around their silver. A group of gamblers hunched in the far corner, dice clattering like bones shaken in a priest's cup. Above it all, a lone lute player sat on a stool near the hearth, plucking a mournful tune that dissolved into the noise long before it reached anyone's ears. PAWEL's gaze swept the room with the trained ease of a man who had walked into taverns that welcomed him, feared him, lied to him, and tried to kill him in equal measure. He took in the crooked shutters, the heavy iron cauldrons bubbling behind the bar, the smell of onions fried in old lard, and the sweet undercurrent of cheap mead, the kind that clung to the tongue like syrup and punished you for it the morning after. Then, like a ripple through still water, the noise softened. It always did when a hussar entered. A few men straightened in their seats. A woman pulled her shawl closer. A butcher froze with a knife halfway through a slab of pork. PAWEL ignored them all. He had no patience for their preconceived notions of him. He'd learned long ago that fear travelled ahead of him like a herald. Beside him, Captain Stanislaw Nowak stepped in with less hesitation, stamping mud from his boots and shaking rainwater off his cloak.
Lovely smell,
he muttered.
almost makes a man forget he's alive. Before Pavel could reply, a man emerged from behind the counter, a tavern keeper with a round belly, a thinning braid, and a face flushed from the heat of his own hearth. His eyes widened when he saw Stanislaw's green captain's coat, and widened further when he saw the blue hussar mantle at Pavel's shoulder.
He hurried forward, bowing more deeply than the cramped space truly required.
Captain Nowak, and a brother knight of the Hussar Order in my humble establishment.
He puffed up a little, pride wrestling hard with fear in his expression.
An honor, truly an honor. If there's anything, absolutely anything, you require, my lords, you need only ask.
Pavel saw the man's hands, proud in gesture but trembling. Something sat heavy behind his eyes. A worry he wore like a stain beneath the skin. Stanislaw leaned in with a grin that was far too wolfish to be comforting.
I've heard things,
the captain said, tapping the tavern keeper's shoulder with mock sympathy.
Rumour has it you've been late with your taxes, and my good brother here,
he gestured casually to Pavel,
has reliable word you're hiding witches in your cellar.
The tavern keeper turned pale. His lips parted, but only a choked breath came out. His gaze flickered to Pavel, wide, pleading, ready to spill his soul onto the floor if it meant survival. Before he could speak, Stanislaw burst out laughing.
By Orion, look at you, almost dropping dead where you stand.
He slapped the tavern keeper's back hard enough to jostle the dust from his tunic.
I'm jesting. You'd think folk in Lublin had more humour.
Stanislaw straightened his back and continued.
All we require from you is a good private table and some mead.
The tavern keeper managed a strangled noise that might have been a laugh. He bowed again, twice, relieved but still shaken.
A jest. Of course, Captain. Of course.
He wiped sweat from his brow.
Please, let me show you to a good table. The best I have. Private as you wish.
Stanislaw nodded and waved toward the dimmer side of the room. The tavern keeper led them past the crowded tables, weaving between benches and spilled drink, until they reached a heavy oak table near the hearth, half sheltered from the noise, half bathed in the warmth of the fire. Logs crackled and spat, throwing flickers of gold across their faces. Pavel sat, leaning slightly toward the captain. That joke, he said under his breath, was a bit harsh. I thought the poor man was going to fall dead at your feet. Stanislaw snorted.
Anyone who looks at your sour face feels like that anyway.
Before Pavel could come up with a retort, the tavern keeper hurried back. In each hand he carried a large clay mug, dripping with fresh mead. He set one before Pavel, one before the captain, with reverence bordering on fear.
Your drinks, my lords, strong, warm, and fresh from the barrel.
And with that, he bowed himself away, leaving them to the fire, the mead, and the long night ahead.
So,
Stanislaw began, raising his mug.
What mischief have you been up to this time, old hound? Word is the order sent you east, out toward Baron Leszek Wałęsa's lands. What transpired there that required the order's attention?
Pavel lifted his mug and let the mead sit on his tongue, a moment before swallowing. It was thick, overly sweet, with a bitter afterbite that tasted of old barrels and long nights. Drink meant to numb, not to comfort. It slid down his throat like a reminder of how many taverns like this he'd sat in, how many questions like Stanislaw's he'd heard before. He breathed out through his nose, slow, tired, and letting the captain's words circle his thoughts before he answered. The question wasn't difficult, but the memories behind it were heavier than he cared to unpack in a room full of strangers. PAWEL set the mug down with a heavy thump, mead spilling over the rim and trailing across the scarred tabletop. "A village on the edge of the forest," he said, voice low and flat with fatigue. "Someone claimed a witch lived there. Children sickening, livestock dropping dead. The same damned tale as always. Fear makes people blind, and blind folk start pointing fingers."
And
Stannislaw leaned in, elbows on the table, the hint of a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He knew the pattern of these stories all too well. PAWEL snorted softly before he answered. "What do you think? No witches. There never are." He rolled the mug between his palms, eyes turned to the flame of the hearth. "Just a widow who knew her herbs better than the rest. Willow bark for fevers, salves for rashes. She'd actually saved a few lives." He paused, jaw tightening before he went on. "But when the children kept dying anyway, they needed someone to blame. And she stood alone." He took a slow drink, the mead doing nothing to soften the bitterness sitting in his chest. His gaze stayed fixed on the hearth, unmoving. The flames shifted and folded in on themselves, and in their depths he seemed to follow shapes only he could see. Fiery echoes of raised voices, the widow's frightened eyes, the hopeless way the villagers had turned on her. It was as if the fire wasn't warming him at all, but instead quietly showing the whole wretched tale back to him in its glowing hearth. Stannislaw exhaled through his nose, already hearing the end of it.
let me guess, someone stood to gain from the outcry.
PAWEL's mouth twitched. Not a smile, more a confirmation. He turned his eyes back to Stannislaw and continued. The village elder, up to his neck in debt. He needed the attention somewhere else, anywhere else. So he nudged the villagers toward her. Let fear do the rest. Stannislaw shook his head, a dry, humorless huff leaving him.
Men never change. Always easiest to condemn the one who can't fight back.
A song as old as Orion's rebellion. PAWEL's gaze drifted back to the fire, the glow catching the tired lines under his eyes. Superstition's cheap, and it cuts deep when someone's desperate enough to swing it. The words settled between them. A drunk bellowed a half-forgotten song somewhere in the back of the hall. Mugs clattered and the fire cracked. But the space around their table felt still, like the embers of a truth neither of them enjoyed revisiting. "So," Stannislaw said at last. PAWEL tore his gaze from the fire and found his friend watching him with that familiar crooked smile.
The verdict, then? Did you deliver it as usual, with your sword?
A muscle in PAWEL's jaw twitched. "When I arrived, the elder was already waiting," he said. He spoke as though everything were already decided. He never imagined I'd look past the lies he fed me. PAWEL's hand slid to the hilt at his side. He drew the blade an inch, just enough for the fire to catch along its edge. "In the end," he said quietly, the steel tasted blood. Just not the blood he expected. He pressed the blade back into the scabbard. The soft metallic click sounded almost final. He reached for his mug, lifted it, and drank. Long. Slow. Letting the mead settle his breathing even as it sharpened the bitterness in his chest. Men like that village elder never change, he thought, the words heavy and silent behind his eyes. He drank again, harder this time. A darker flicker crossed his gaze as he lowered the mug. Somewhere deep within him, a quiet truth settled. The world seemed lighter without men like that. And some sentences he found weighed far less heavy on the soul. Stanislaw nodded slowly, asking no more. He didn't need to. Some judgments needed no further words. He let his gaze linger on the sword that had just glimmered in the firelight, then on Pavel's face. He took a slow sip of mead and eased back in his chair. The hard lines in his expression softened.
You know,
He said, lifting his mug with a half grin.
that steel is starting to look like you, Powell. Worn, scarred, full of cracks. Maybe it's time to let a smith forge you something that isn't on its last breath.
Pavel's thumb traced the pommel before he slid the blade fully back into its scabbard. He shot Stanislaw a crooked, reluctant smile, more a concession than amusement. Do you have any idea how expensive a good sword is? Stanislaw barked out a laugh, loud enough to turn a few heads before the tavern noise swallowed it.
Yes, but do you know how costly it is to keep carrying a bad one?
Pavel didn't answer. He simply raised his mug, took another gulp of mead, and let the burn run down his throat. Worn or not, he thought, feeling the familiar weight of the blade against his leg. The steel had always been enough. So far. Tell me about you, Pavel said, his voice lower now. How fares the law in this city? Stanislaw blinked, eyebrows rising as though the question had nudged him from a different train of thought. Then a slow grin tugged at his mouth. He leaned back, stretching his shoulders with a theatrical sigh, and lifted his mug in a small salute.
Oh, the law?
He said, swirling the mead as if weighing its worth.
Same miserable business as always. We catch a scoundrel or two every week, keep the city from falling completely to pieces.
He took a hearty drink, foam catching in his moustache, before wiping it off with the back of his hand, chuckling to himself.
Just this week we collared a band of smugglers down at the harbour. Thought they were clever, hauling crates through the fog. Now they're cooling their heels in the cells, waiting for whatever justice decides to do with them.
He tilted his head toward Pavel, one brow arched, eyes glinting with mischief.
We can't all pass judgment as swiftly as you lot,
He said, giving Pavel's arm a playful nudge.
Some of us still pretend to follow procedure.
Pavel gave a short, rasping chuckle. Swift, yes, but it isn't always a blessing. The city's arm of justice may be slow and weary. He lifted his mug and turned it lightly in his hand, but sometimes that also means it sees more than we do.
And sometimes it only means
Stanislaw countered with a broad grin.
that the thieves have time to hide their spoils and bribe the right men before judgment falls.
They caught each other's gaze for a moment. Two men on opposite sides of the road to justice, bound by as much respect as difference. Then Stanislaw lifted his mug and barked a laugh that seemed to shove the last remnants of tension off the table.
But never when it comes to mead.
He clinked his mug against Pavel's with enough force to slosh foam over both their hands. Pavel let out a low, genuine laugh, the kind he didn't often hear from himself anymore. The sound blended easily into the tavern's clamour, swallowed by dice rattling, arguments rising, and drunken songs trying to find their rhythm. For a moment Pavel simply sat there, letting the warmth of the fire settle into his bones and the warmth of the mead settle behind his ribs. He'd forgotten, he realized, how grounding it was to share a drink with Stanislaw. There was a steadiness to the man, dutiful, sharp-witted, stubborn in all the right ways, that had always made Pavel respect him more than most. Not a bad idea after all, he admitted silently as he took another drink. It wasn't often he allowed himself to enjoy an evening, let alone the company. But even as he watched Stanislaw grin over his mug, a small, familiar tug stirred at the back of his mind. With Stanislaw, there was always something else beneath the surface. Another thought, another intention waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The man never asked Pavel to meet without a reason, even if he wrapped that reason in laughter and mead. Pavel narrowed his eyes just a little, though the smile remained. He'll get to it, he thought. He always does. The laughter faded and the tavern's murmur filled the air once more. Stanislaw set down his mug, but instead of reaching to refill it, he drummed his fingers on the tabletop. His eyes narrowed, as if he carried something heavier than smugglers and thieves.
Have you heard,
He began quietly, almost whispering.
what they're saying about Lipski Castle?
Pavel frowned. I've been away. What now? That Boris drank himself senseless again? Duke Boris Lipski was the young ruler of this duchy, scarcely more than 25 winters old, yet already a name spoken in equal parts respect and fear. He was known for his strength and his temper, as quick to raise a cup as to raise a sword. Despite his youth, he bore himself like a veteran, and rightly so. He had already fought in 2 wars at the side of Duke Waldemar of Duskhaven. On the battlefield, he always carried the family's heirloom, a massive war hammer passed from father to son for generations. The weapon had crushed foes long before he was born, and every strike he dealt carved another bloody line into the Lipski family's chronicle. Upon their coat of arms stood the bison flanked by 2 green hills, a sign that the house of Lipski had ruled over Lublin since the city first rose from the earth. Many therefore called Boris Lipski the young bison of Lublin, a name that seemed to carry both the weight of tradition and the burden of his hammer. Pavel recalled the rumours of the Duke's first battle, a youth with blood in his eyes who hurled himself at the enemy without fear, breaking bones as if the hammer were the extension of his own fury. Courage, the people had called it. Folly, thought Pavel. He let his fingers trace the rim of his mug and stared into the dark surface. For men like Boris Lipski, the world was simple. Strength gave right, fear gave obedience. But Pavel had seen enough to know that justice could never be built on terror. Terror always rotted into hatred, and hatred always brought blood. Stanislaw did not smile. He leaned closer, and in the firelight his face was drawn into deeper shadows.
No, worse, the Duchess has given birth, a daughter.
And? Pavel raised an eyebrow, though Stanislaw's tone made him hesitate before taking his next sip.
And the child.
Stanislaw drew out the words. He glanced around the tavern as if someone might be listening before he went on.
The child is not like others. They say she is marked, deformed, that her eyes are slanted, her face twisted.
He paused, letting the words sink in. Over by the door, a drunk was shouting at a serving girl, but the sound never reached their table.
People whisper,
He continued,
that it's a curse, that dark powers have been cast over Lipski blood. The Duchess herself is said to be convinced, and the priests...
He made a gesture as if unwilling to say more. Pavel ran a hand through his short beard and stared into his mug. The tavern's chatter suddenly felt distant, muted, as though the world itself held its breath around the tale. A cursed child, he said at last, his tone dry. That's what they say every time someone is born different. A witch, a demon, a curse. I've heard it all before my friend.
Perhaps,
Stanislaw muttered, shrugging, though his eyes remained dark.
but this time it is the Duke's child, and when the castle trembles, the whole city follows. You know how men are, fearful, mad, and madmen do dangerous things.
He drank deep, wiped his mouth and whispered,
I tell you, Pavel, something wicked stirs up there in the castle.
Stanislaw sat in silence for a moment after his dramatic words, the space filled only by the crackle of the fire and the rattle of dice further back in the room. He stroked his greying beard and leaned closer.
I tell you, Pavel, we must do something. Duke Boris Lipski is hot-tempered enough without rumors of curses. If he comes to believe that a witch threatens his family,
He made a crushing gesture with his hand.
then this could end in blood, a great deal of blood.
Pavel nodded slowly. He knew the Duke's temper well enough from rumor. Boris Lipski was a man who would sooner kill a man than ask one question too many. Best to strangle this in its cradle, he muttered, before it grows into an inferno. Stanislaw nodded eagerly, relieved to hear him say it.
The Duchess wants the order involved. She believes you are the only ones who can bring clarity.
His eyes locked onto Pavel's, all levity gone.
But I don't trust any of your other brothers as I trust you. If one of the more devout takes this case, then we both know how it could end.
Pavel let his gaze rest on the flames in the hearth. He pictured the fanatical eyes of some of his brethren, men who saw darkness in every shadow. He could already imagine the conclusion. At best, the death of an infant. At worst, a witch hunt that would engulf half of Lublin in its blaze. He drained the last of his mead, wiped his short-trimmed moustache with the back of his hand, and nodded. You're right. I'd best take this myself. I've seen enough of these farces to know where they lead. Let me handle it before someone else makes it worse. Stanislaw let out a heavy sigh, as though setting down a weight he had carried in his chest.
Then there is hope for both the child and the city.
Don't overdo it now. Powell chuckled, shaking his mug in a gesture that spoke plainly. Empty. Stanislaw rose with a laugh, swept out his arm, and bowed deeply, almost like a court jester before his liege lord.
Of course, our brave knight should not have to face the darkness on an empty stomach. Let us fill his cup so that he may save us from ourselves.
A few guests at the nearby tables caught his words and began to applaud the theatrical display, unaware of the gravity behind it. Stanislaw scowled at them with a grimace, but Pavel only shook his head. He exhaled, ran a hand through his beard, and murmured with a half-smile, "What did I say about overdoing it?"